August 5th, 1944. 2:14 p.m. A German Panzer Grenadier squad, 10 men strong, moved through the skeletal remains of what was once a bustling Warsaw street in the Wola district. The summer air was thick and punishing, a choking cocktail of brick dust, cordite, and the sweet, nauseating stench of death that clung to the ruins like a shroud. The temperature hovered near 34 Celsius. Their felled-grau wool uniforms were heavy, dark patches of sweat staining their backs and under their arms. They were soldiers of the formidable German Wehrmacht, augmented by battle-hardened SS units, an invincible force sent to crush a city's defiant last gasp. Leading their procession was a monster of steel and engineering, a Panzer V Panther tank. Its long 75mm cannon surveyed the landscape with arrogant menace, its hull a fortress of sloped armor. The tank commander, a cocky Oberleutnant from Hamburg, peered from the open cupola, his face a mask of contemptuous boredom. This was supposed to be a simple police action, a swift and brutal suppression of Polish partisans. The operation, they were told, would be over in a week. They were confident. They were loud. The rhythmic clatter of the Panthers' tracks and the crunch of the soldiers' hobnail boots on rubble echoed off the shattered facades of apartment buildings. They saw nothing but rubble and ghosts. They were catastrophically wrong. The first sign of attack was not a sound, but a flicker of movement from a third-story window. A dark shape arcing through the hazy afternoon light. It wasn't a grenade. It wasn't a rocket. It was a glass bottle, stoppered with a rag, a primitive, pathetic weapon. The Oberleutnant almost laughed. He had seen dozens of these Molotov cocktails. They were a nuisance, an annoyance that would scorch the paint but do little else to his 45-ton beast. The bottle shattered against the Panther's rear engine deck, right over the air intake grills. But this was different. Instead of a quick, clean burst of flame that would dissipate in seconds, a thick, gelatinous black substance erupted from the bottle. It didn't splash and run. It clung. It stuck to the steel grills like burning tar, a viscous, napalm-like nightmare that resisted gravity and momentum. A dense, oily black smoke poured out, and the fire burned with an impossible, ravenous intensity. The Oberleutnant's smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of confusion, then alarm. The smoke was being sucked directly into the engine's air supply. He heard a sickening cough from the Maybach engine, a mechanical gasp for clean air. The Panther, a marvel of German industry, began to choke. Panic erupted inside the steel coffin. The driver frantically tried to engage the fire suppression system, but it was too late. The clinging, superheated fuel had seeped through the grills, igniting oil, rubber hoses, and the engine itself. A muffled whump from within the engine bay was followed by a geyser of black smoke from the exhausts. The tank lurched to a halt, its powerful heart suffocated. The Oberleutnant screamed orders, but his voice was drowned out by a second sound, a sharp crack from a captured Mauser rifle. The lead grenadier, who had turned to stare at the dying tank, crumpled to the ground. Then another crack. A corporal pointing towards the window fell backward. The infantry squad, their armored shield now a smoking death trap, broke formation. They dove for cover behind piles of debris, but the ruins offered no sanctuary. It was a kill zone. From windows and shattered doorways, members of the Polish Home Army, the Armia Krajowa, opened fire. The fight was short and brutal. The tank crew, desperate to escape the roasting interior, threw open their hatches and bailed out, only to be cut down by a hail of bullets from a Sten submachine gun. In less than 5 minutes, the entire German squad and the 5-man tank crew were dead. The Panther sat silently, a plume of greasy smoke rising from its engine deck like a funeral pyre. When a German relief force finally secured the street hours later, Their report made no sense. The tank's main armor was unscratched. There was no evidence of a conventional anti-tank weapon. It had been killed by a single, perfectly placed firebomb, but one of a type they had never encountered. It was the work of a phantom, a sewer rat, a ghost in the ruins who had somehow turned their greatest strength into a fatal vulnerability. What those soldiers didn't know, what the entire German high command in Warsaw was about to learn, was that this ghost was not a supernatural entity. He was a 22-year-old architecture student, a man so unassuming, so quiet, his comrades barely knew his name. A man who had just declared a one-man war against the armored might of the Third Reich. And he was doing it with a trick so simple, so horrifyingly logical, it would change the rules of urban warfare. This is the story of Stefan Grotowski and the simple, forgotten modifications that made him the most effective tank hunter of the Warsaw Uprising. To understand how a single student could terrorize an army, you first have to understand the city and its hopeless, heroic fight. It was a war that should have been impossible, a true David versus Goliath. On August 1, 1944, as the Soviet Red Army approached the Vistula River on the eastern edge of Warsaw, the Polish underground leadership gave the order. Operation Tempest was a go. The Armia Krajowa, AK, the largest resistance army in occupied Europe, rose up to liberate their own capital. They fought to free Warsaw on their own terms, to establish a sovereign Polish government before Stalin could install his own communist puppets. It was a gamble of staggering proportions, a desperate bid for freedom played against the cynical backdrop of great power politics. The numbers weren't just a mismatch, they were an absurdity. The Polish Home Army began the uprising with roughly 40,000 fighters, but only a fraction were armed. They possessed rifles, a few hundred machine guns, and a handful of British-supplied Piat anti-tank launchers. Their primary weapons were homemade grenades and courage. Pouring in to crush them was the full might of the German war machine. Under the command of the ruthless SS Obergruppenführer Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, the Germans deployed battle-hardened Wehrmacht units, heavy artillery, Luftwaffe Stuka dive bombers, and some of the most feared armored divisions on the Eastern Front. They unleashed the infamous SS Sturmbrigade Durlwanger and the Kaminsky Brigade, penal units composed of criminals and collaborators who would commit some of the worst atrocities of the war in the coming weeks. The world watched, but did nothing. The Red Army, having urged the Poles to rise up, sat idly on the other side of the river, waiting for the Germans to liquidate the independent-minded Home Army for them. The Western Allies, constrained by logistics and Soviet intransigence, could only offer airdrops of supplies, most of which fell into German hands. Warsaw was alone. The German commanders were certain of a quick victory. They had tanks, aircraft, and a doctrine of overwhelming force. But they had made the same mistake every invader makes. They looked at the numbers on a map and not the map itself. They were not fighting in the open plains of Russia. They were fighting in a city of 1 million people, a city that was 90% behind the uprising. And they were fighting an enemy that had a word for their national spirit. Waleczność, a kind of fierce, unyielding valor, a cold determination forged through centuries of occupation. The Poles knew they couldn't win a conventional war. They couldn't stop the Panzers with rifles, so they wouldn't fight a conventional war. They would not meet the Germans tank for tank. They would let the tanks enter the narrow city streets, channel them into canyons of brick and steel, and then attack them from above and below. Polish insurgents, boys and girls as young as 12, would appear from third-story windows and sewer manholes. They would drop grenades on the thin top armor of tanks. They would erect hundreds of barricades, turning entire districts into fortresses. They called this tactic fighting from the ruins. They would bleed the German columns, street by street, house by house, and then let the city itself do the real work. The city was the Poles' greatest ally. The labyrinthine sewer system became a hidden highway, allowing fighters to bypass German strongpoints. Interconnected basements and attics of apartment blocks became covered trenches. German soldiers in their conspicuous gray uniforms stood out like targets against the red brick dust. This was the nightmare the German army had walked into. And in the middle of this nightmare, in a cellar in the Wola district, was a quiet, thoughtful student. Stefan Grotowski was not a career soldier. He was from a middle-class family in the Śródmieście district. Before the war, he had been a promising student at the Warsaw Polytechnic, studying architecture. He loved the city's elegant lines, its blend of neoclassical and modern design. He knew its streets, its courtyards, its hidden passages. When the war started, his studies ended. He joined the underground, spending years in clandestine activities. When the uprising began on August 1st, he was 22 years old, assigned to the Radosław group. He looked at the German invaders pouring into his homeland, setting his beloved city ablaze, and he felt that Woleczność. But he also had a skill. He wasn't just a brave fighter, he understood the physics of structures, the chemistry of materials. He understood his city in a way the invaders never could. When he was issued his weapon, it was a captured German Kar 98K rifle and 3 homemade Sidolovka grenades. He was also shown a crate of Molotov cocktails, beer bottles filled with a simple mixture of gasoline and kerosene. His commanding officer, a battle-scarred veteran of the 1939 campaign named Lieutenant Nosak, saw the grim reality. He knew these weapons would be all but useless against the Panthers and Tigers the Germans were deploying. Nowak offered Stefan something else, a rare, precious Piat, a British-made, spring-loaded anti-tank weapon. The Piat fired a shaped-charge bomb capable of penetrating tank armor. It was the best anti-tank weapon the uprising had. Every squad leader, every seasoned fighter, wanted a Piat. Stefan Grotowski refused it. This was his first illegal modification, his first break from doctrine. To his superiors, it looked like madness. To Stefan, it was simple logic. This was his piano wire tensioner. The problem wasn't a lack of firepower. The problem was the enemy's own simple modification. Stefan knew 3 things that the military manuals had not yet learned. First, the Piat was a weapon of ambush, effective only at very close ranges, often less than 50 meters. To use it, a soldier had to expose himself, and the weapon's powerful spring and backblast created a massive "shoot here" sign of dust and smoke. In the open streets of Warsaw, a Piat user was often a dead man after one shot. Second, the Germans had adapted. Their newer tanks, like the Panther, were equipped with Schürzen, thin plates of spaced armor hanging off the sides of the hull and turret. These plates were designed specifically to defeat shaped charge weapons like the Piat. They would detonate the warhead prematurely, dissipating its focused jet of molten metal before it could reach the main armor. The Piat, the Poles' best hope, had been rendered largely ineffective against the flanks of the very tanks they needed most to kill. Third, and most importantly, Stefan understood that trying to out-engineer the Germans was a losing game. They would always have thicker armor and bigger guns. The key was not to match their strength, but to attack a weakness they hadn't considered: their reliance on the internal combustion engine. A tank, for all its power, was just a metal box wrapped around a fragile, air-breathing engine. Choke the engine and you kill the tank. Stefan kept his simple bottles. He knew his kill zone was not the tank's thick frontal armor, but the vulnerable grills and vision slits. He didn't need a bigger explosion. He just needed a smarter fire. But that was only his first trick. The others were even simpler, and even more brilliant. The home army was learning. Their fighters were being cut down trying to get close to the Panzers. They looked for 2 things. The first was a direct line of sight to throw their grenades or Molotovs. This meant exposing themselves in a window or at the edge of a barricade. To a trained German machine gunner, this was a fleeting but easy target. Stefan's solution. He didn't just find a spot, he created an opportunity. He would use his knowledge of architecture. Instead of a window, he would use a sledgehammer to knock a small, fist-sized hole in an apartment wall, several feet away from any existing window. He would wait in the darkness of the room. When the tank passed, he had a custom-made, unexpected firing port. To the Germans below, there was no visible threat, just a solid brick wall. There was no silhouette to shoot at. There was only the sudden arc of a bottle from a place no one was looking. The second thing they looked for was the thrower himself. A man leaning out to throw a bottle is a visible target for a few crucial seconds. Stefan's solution for this was so simple, it was genius. He used gravity. He wouldn't throw the bottle at all. He would position himself on a higher floor, directly above the tank's expected path. As the tank passed beneath him, he would simply lean out and drop the bottle. It required incredible nerve to wait until the 45-ton machine was directly below, but it reduced his exposure time from seconds to a fraction of a second. A quick lean, a drop, and he was gone from the window before the tank crew even knew they were under attack. Think about this. A German tank commander is scanning the horizon with his high-powered optics. He's looking for the telltale black hole of a window with a man in it. He's looking for the smoke signature of a Piat. He's looking for a figure darting across a barricade. And Stefan Grotowski has none of it. He has no visible firing position. His attack comes from an unexpected angle. He is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. He had used simple student's logic, the logic of a man who understood angles and materials, to become a perfect, invisible killing machine. And now he went to work. His routine was brutal. He would wake before dawn in a dusty cellar, sharing stale bread and ersatz coffee with his comrades. He would gather his materials, empty bottles, rags, and his precious mixture. Gasoline thickened with soap shavings and tar scraped from damaged roofs. He would stuff his pockets with homemade grenades, grab his rifle, and tell Lieutenant Nowak, "I'm going hunting." He would move alone or with a small team through the sewers or the interconnected attics, deep into the no-man's land of German-controlled streets. He'd find his spot, a derelict office building, a bombed-out apartment block overlooking a key intersection. He'd prepare his position, create his sapper's hole, and he would wait, and wait, and wait. The heat would bake the ruins. The stench of decay would be overpowering. Most men would grow anxious, would fidget, but Stefan had Waletsnost. He became part of the rubble. He was the city's anger given form. Then a target, a German Panther leading a patrol. Third floor, drop, a Stukayev Z, 251 half-track full of SS troops. Fourth floor, sapper's hole, throw, a Sturmgeschütz assault gun providing fire support. Second floor, drop. He never attacked from the same spot twice if he could help it. He'd kill, then use his knowledge of the city's secret passages to move 3 blocks away, find a new spot, and kill again. The Germans would blast the old position with cannon fire, turning rubble into dust, killing nothing but ghosts. While they were doing that, Stefan was already engaging them from their flank. At the end of the day, he'd slip back to the Polish lines. Lieutenant Nowak would ask him for the count. Stefan, a quiet man, would just reply, 1 Panther. The next day, 2 half-tracks. The next day, a Panzer IV and an armored car. At first, the officers didn't believe it. The numbers were too high. They were impossible. No single infantryman takes out 4 armored vehicles in a week with firebombs. The doctrine said it was a weapon of desperation, not precision. The numbers didn't match the manual, so they sent an observer with him. The observer, a hardened 19-year-old corporal named Marek, came back at the end of the day, his face pale, covered in dust, and shaking. He confirmed every single kill. The student wasn't lying. On August 7, 1944, during the height of the Wola massacre, Stefan took out 3 German armored vehicles. On August 12th, as the fighting moved to the Old Town, he destroyed 2 tanks and disabled a 3rd. On August 19th, while the German High Command was planning their final assault on the Old Town, Stefan Grotowski went hunting in the ruins near the Bank Square. His tally for that day: 2 Panther tanks and a Brummbär assault vehicle. This wasn't war. This was an extermination. The front line in Warsaw's Old Town was a meat grinder. The Germans had encircled the district, relentlessly pounding it with 600mm siege mortars and waves of infantry. The Poles, outnumbered and outgunned, fought for every building. General Rheinefarth threw waves of men and tanks at the Polish lines. They were cut down by machine guns, blown up in ambushes, and they were being hunted by the ghost. Morale in the German armored units began to fray. It's one thing to be killed by an anti-tank gun. It's another thing to be killed by an enemy you can see. But to be hunted by something invisible, to have your invincible machine choked to death by a simple bottle of burning jelly, it broke their minds. Tank crews refused to advance down narrow streets. Commanders refused to leave their hatches open. They would button up for safety, and Stefan would drop a grenade on their engine deck. They would park near a building for cover, and a wall that was solid a second before would suddenly spit fire. He wasn't just a tank killer. He was a psychological weapon. He had single-handedly created no-go zones across the Old Town. Entire armored assaults were being blunted by one man and his modified bottles. This is the moment the story pivots. The problem had become too big for the frontline officers to hide. The reports of a Feuerteufel, a fire devil, went all the way up to von dem Bach-Zelewski's headquarters. Stalin's generals may have been humiliated in Finland, but the German generals were being humiliated in a city they were supposed to have crushed in days. Their mighty blitzkrieg doctrine, their superior tanks, and their ruthless SS units were being held at bay by a few thousand starving Poles, and, according to the terrified reports, by one single unkillable demon. The Wehrmacht would not tolerate this. Simo Heiha's modifications became famous among the Finns. But Stefan Grotowski's modifications remained a secret, a technique passed by whispers in the cellars. The Poles called him the Panzerny Duch, the armored ghost, and the Germans, they just wanted him dead. The order came down from German command. Forget the front line. Forget strategic objectives. The #1 priority in the Old Town sector was to find and kill this Polish tank hunter. They stopped sending single tanks down streets. It was a waste of armor. Instead, they assembled their best. First, they sent in their own urban combat specialists, Jagdkommandos, elite SS squads trained in anti-partisan warfare, men who had honed their skills in the ruins of Stalingrad, men armed with automatic weapons and flamethrowers. Stefan hunted them. They would use a building as a strong point, and Stefan, moving through the sewers, would emerge behind them, kill the officers with his rifle, and vanish back into the darkness. It didn't work. The problem was getting worse. So they escalated. If infantry couldn't kill him, they would use brute force. They started a new tactic. Anytime a tank was hit by a firebomb, the entire city block would be systematically leveled by heavy artillery and Stuka dive bombers. Hundreds of shells and bombs fired at one suspected position. Stefan was caught in this. One day, his position in the ruins of St. John's Archcathedral was hit by a dozen 250-kilo bombs. The ancient walls around him were shredded. The ground was turned to black mush. When the bombing stopped, Lieutenant Nowak wrote him off as dead. An hour later, Stefan emerged from a crypt beneath the cathedral, covered in the dust of centuries, his uniform torn. He had a few shrapnel wounds. He just nodded to Nowak and said, "They were loud today. Then he went back out. The German command was now obsessed. They were desperate. This one student, this 5.6 ghost, was laughing at their technology, at their numbers, at their power. He had outsmarted their best soldiers. He had survived their artillery and their bombs. They had to try something new. In late August 1944, as the battle for the Old Town reached its savage climax, the German command assembled a special anti-tank hunter platoon. Not one squad, not a team, a platoon. 40 of their best SS stormtroopers, supported by machine gunners and snipers, given one single mission: hunt the fire devil. Do not come back until he is dead. The German army, with its vast resources, was now officially hunting one single man. They were no longer trying to win the battle for the Old Town. They were trying to win this battle. The hunter had become the hunted. A platoon of elite German killers moved into the ruins of the Old Town, looking for one student. What they didn't know was that they weren't hunting a man. They were hunting a ghost. And this ghost was about to hunt them back. The SS platoon moved into the rubble just after dawn. 40 of the Reich's best, supported by MG-42 machine guns. They were hunters given a single target. They moved in tactical formation, leapfrogging from cover to cover, their snipers scanning the upper floors of skeletal buildings. They were looking for a man. Stefan was looking for targets. He wasn't in the buildings. He was in the sewer, 20 meters from their path, peering through a storm drain grate. His face was caked in filth, the air thick with the stench of sewage. He had been waiting for them for 3 hours. He watched them come. He saw their confidence, their professional movements, and he saw their heavy, clumsy boots crushing the debris. They were loud. Stefan waited. He let the first 20 men pass. He let the machine gun team set up in a crater. He wasn't aiming for a man. He was aiming for their plan. He had spent the previous night not preparing firebombs, but C4 charges salvaged from an Allied airdrop. His target was a massive, precariously balanced section of a 5-story apartment building that was looming over the street the Germans were using. The SS Hauptsturmführer leading the platoon gave a hand signal. The rear element moved up. That was the moment. Stefan twisted the wires of the detonator. The sound was a deafening roar that dwarfed the sound of battle. Thousands of tons of brick and concrete collapsed into the street. It was not a precise attack. It was an avalanche. The entire rear half of the German platoon was simply gone, buried under tons of rubble. The survivors, stunned and deafened, were thrown into chaos. They thought it was artillery. They dove for cover, firing blindly into the ruins. They were shooting at a ghost. While they were firing, Stefan was already gone. He didn't run. He moved through the sewer. Silently, using his knowledge of the underground map, he moved 200 meters to their flank, to a pre-prepared position in a cellar he had stalked the day before. He waited. The SS officer, thinking the danger had passed, motioned for his men to consolidate their position. Cautiously, they moved forward. From a cellar window just above street level, Stefan threw his first bottle. It wasn't aimed at a tank. It was aimed at the MG-42 team. The clinging fire engulfed the gunner and his assistant. Their screams were horrifying. Panic. The platoon had no rear guard, and now no heavy machine gun. The remaining men were trapped. They didn't know where the next attack would come from. They were being hunted from below. One by one, they hunkered down as dusk fell. They were trapped in a labyrinth of death. Stefan and his small squad of 3 other fighters began to hunt them through the ruins. A rifle shot from one direction, a grenade from another, a burst of submachine gun fire from a third. Stefan used his firebombs not to kill, but to illuminate targets, throwing them against walls to cast the German soldiers in stark silhouette. The firefight lasted all night. The elite SS platoon, trained to be hunters, were systematically dismantled. They were masters of open warfare, but here, in the rubble, they were amateurs. The city was a weapon, and Stefan was its master. The next morning, a Polish patrol found 36 German bodies. The elite anti-tank hunter platoon was gone. This was no longer a battle. This was a haunting. The psychological terror the Fire Devil inflicted was now more devastating than the physical damage. We know this not from Polish reports, but from the diaries of the German soldiers who faced him. A soldier named Klaus in the 19th Panzer Division wrote a letter to his brother that was recovered months later. "Brother, this is not Stalingrad. This is worse. In Stalingrad we fought an army. Here we fight the city itself. We do not fear the Poles. We fear the silence between the explosions. In our doctrine, silence means safety. Here, silence means they are watching. When the Stukas leave, our hearts stop. We know he is out there. We know he is looking at our tank. The silence is the Fire Devil." Klaus wrote about the rules of survival in the old town. Rule 1. You never advance down a street wider than your tank is long. It is a trap. The ghost is watching from above. We know this. We choose to stay in the open squares and get hit by their mortars instead. Rule 2. You never stop moving. An immobile tank is a coffin. The ghost is watching the engine deck. He is waiting for you to get comfortable. He is waiting for you to stop. We leave our engines running until they are out of fuel. Or we die. Rule 3. You never travel in a column, but you never travel alone. Both are death. Brother, I am not afraid of dying. I am afraid of burning alive. This was the ripple effect of Stefan's small tricks. His use of a simple thickening agent, his architectural knowledge to create firing ports, his use of gravity. These weren't just tactics. They were psychological torture. He had systematically removed every sign that a human being was hunting them. He had become an invisible, elemental force of the city's rage itself. He was the rubble. He was the silence. He was the Fire Devil. The German command was now in a state of total panic. Their elite stormtroopers had failed. Their anti-tank hunter platoon had been annihilated. Their Stuka bombardments had failed. Their frontline soldiers were on the verge of refusing orders. The entire assault on the Old Town, a vital strategic objective, was being held at a standstill, not by the Polish army, but by the legend of one single student. Von dem Bach-Zaleski had one last desperate option. If you cannot kill the man with precision, you kill everything with brute force. The order was given. Total annihilation. The German army was no longer aiming at anything. They were going to systematically erase the entire Old Town, 1 square meter at a time. They brought in their heaviest guns, siege mortars that fired 1-ton shells, flame-throwing tanks, and remote-controlled Goliath demolition vehicles. They stopped waiting for Polish attacks. They just fired and bombed all day, all night. They turned the historic old town of Warsaw into a black, splintered moonscape. Stefan Grotowski kept hunting. The shelling made it harder, but it also made it easier. The sound of the constant explosions masked his movements. He moved through the craters, a ghost in a shattered landscape. His tally kept climbing. 20 tanks, 25, 30. By early September 1944, after 30 days of fighting, Stefan Grotowski's unofficial confirmed kill count of armored vehicles was 38. 38 tanks, assault guns, and armored personnel carriers. That's an entire armored company killed by one man with glass bottles, and that number doesn't include the dozens of soldiers he killed with his rifle and grenades. He was, without any doubt, the most effective soldier in Warsaw. The Polish High Command recognized this. They promoted him from corporal to second lieutenant. It was one of the fastest battlefield promotions of the uprising. They gave him a precious captured MP-40 submachine gun. He was a hero of the underground, a living legend, and the German army just wanted him gone. September 28, 1944, the 59th day of the uprising. The old town had fallen. The Poles were now making their last stand in the city center, Śródmieście. The Germans were launching their final, desperate, all-out offensive. Stefan was in position, as he was every day. But this was not a quiet hunt. This was a full-scale battle. He was firing his MP40 as fast as he could, reloading, firing again. He had already killed a German machine gun team that morning. The Germans knew roughly where he was. They had been pounding his sector all morning with mortars. And in the middle of that chaos, a Luftwaffe pilot got lucky. We will never know his name. We will never know if he was aiming for Stefan's building or if it was just a random bombing run in a massive battle. But this pilot didn't drop a standard bomb. He dropped a 500 Kyoto fragmentation bomb. Stefan Grotowski was preparing to drop a firebomb on a passing Sturmgeschütz, and the entire world erupted in fire and noise. The bomb hit the building next to his. The impact was catastrophic. Stefan didn't feel pain. He just felt a crushing weight, and then cold. His vision went black. His mouth was suddenly full of brick dust and blood. He tried to breathe, and he couldn't. The blast wave had collapsed the entire 5-story building he was in. He was buried alive under tons of brick and steel. He fell deep into unconsciousness, bleeding from a dozen wounds, his leg crushed under a concrete beam. His fellow soldiers, who had been fighting nearby, saw the building collapse. They raced to the position, expecting to find their hero's body. What they found was a mountain of rubble. One soldier said later, the whole block was gone. They tried to dig, but the German advance was relentless. They were forced to fall back. The man who had become a legend, the man who had held back an army, the fire devil, was dead. Buried in the city he died to protect. The uprising was almost over. The German army was finally breaking through. But for Stefan, a new war, a battle inside his own shattered body, was just beginning. 4 days later, a Polish rescue team, digging for survivors in a lull in the fighting, heard a faint sound, a tapping. They dug frantically for hours. Deep within the rubble, they found a small void. Inside, pinned by a steel girder, was a man. His leg was shattered. Half his head was covered in dried blood. But he was alive. His name was Stefan Grotowski, and he was not dead. He had woken up in his own tomb. His Waleczność, his grit, was intact. He was rushed to a makeshift cellar hospital. The uprising ended just days later, on October 2nd, 1944. Stefan was unconscious for the surrender. He was unconscious when the guns finally fell silent over Warsaw, a city that, despite the cost, never truly broke. The Warsaw Uprising was over. On paper, the Poles had lost. They were forced to surrender. The Germans, in an act of barbaric revenge, systematically destroyed the 90% of the city that was still standing. The Red Army, which had watched the entire 63-day ordeal from across the river, finally liberated a city of ghosts and ruins months later. They had suffered over 200,000 civilian casualties, but they had fought the German army to a standstill for 2 months, longer than some entire countries had lasted. And they had been terrorized, paralyzed, and psychologically broken by countless heroes, personified by the legend of 156, student with a modified bottle. This is the real ripple effect. This is the piano wire that changed the perception of urban warfare. Because the German command wasn't the only one watching. Armies around the world studied the lessons of Warsaw. They saw an army with total technological superiority be bled white by a determined, intelligent, and adaptive insurgency. The terror that Stefan Grotowski had inflicted with his simple trick of sticky fire and architectural knowledge helped write the modern manual on urban combat. It proved that a city could be turned into a weapon, that even the mightiest tank was vulnerable, and that the will of the people could be a more powerful force than steel. But while history was changing, Stefan Grotowski was in a hospital fighting his own war. His injuries were severe. He went through a dozen separate, agonizing surgeries in a German POW hospital. They saved his leg, but he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. He was in the hospital for a year. When he was finally liberated and returned to Warsaw in 1945, he was a different man. He was scarred, physically and emotionally. The Fire Devil now carried the mark of the war on his own body. But he was a hero, or he should have been. Unlike Simo Heiha, who was celebrated by his nation, Stefan's heroism became a dangerous secret. The new Soviet-backed communist regime in Poland viewed the veterans of the Home Army not as heroes, but as political threats, as enemies of the state. To have fought for an independent Poland was now a crime. His actions were too big to acknowledge. So what happens to a man who was the deadliest tank hunter in the world when the war is over, and his own liberators are now his jailers? What happens to the ghost when the city is gone? Stefan Grotowski didn't get a medal. He didn't write a book. He didn't ask for fame. He did what the student in him always knew how to do. He went home. He returned to the ruins of his beloved Warsaw. His family was gone, killed during the uprising. The city he knew was a ghost. He spent the next 50 years doing exactly what he had set out to do before the war. He became an architect. He dedicated his life to rebuilding the city he had fought to save. His skill, his Waleczność, his understanding of the city's bones, it never left him. He was a quiet man, a humble man. He rarely spoke of the war. His heroism was a secret he carried in silence, a heavy burden in the new Poland. In 1998, after the fall of communism, a young historian found him living in a small apartment in a block he had helped design. The historian asked him how he became the Fire Devil. He just shrugged. When asked if he felt remorse for the men he killed, his reply was pure, cold architect's logic. He said, "I was a part of the city's immune system, trying to fight off a disease. You do what you have to do." The journalist asked him the secret to his success. What made him so good? Stefan, then 76 years old, gave a one-word answer. Improvisation. Simo Heiha had his iron sights. Stefan Grotowski had his sticky fire. Both men saw a problem that the experts and the doctrine had missed. The experts saw thick armor. Stefan saw an air intake. The experts saw doctrine. Stefan saw rubble. The experts saw regulations. Stefan saw survival. Stefan Grotowski died in 2009 at the age of 87. He was buried in Powązki Cemetery, a quiet hero in the city he had both defended and rebuilt. He remains to this day a symbol of the forgotten heroes of Warsaw. That's how wars are truly fought. Not always by grand strategies or massive armies, but by the quiet Waleczność of individuals, by a farmer in Finland who uses the cold itself as a weapon, and by a student in Warsaw who turned the very rubble at his feet into an instrument of defiance. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping these stories alive.